It always started the same way for Mira, a deep, heavy weight pinning her to the bed, a suffocating pressure she couldn't shake. She would wake up in the dead of night, her eyes wide open, staring at the shadows around her room, but her body was frozen in place, completely paralyzed. She could feel the weight pressing down on her chest, each breath becoming more of a struggle. Mira tried to scream, to lift a hand, even just to twitch her fingers, but nothing would respond. She was trapped in her own body, powerless, aware, and she wasn't alone. It was the shadows that frightened her the most. The darkness seemed to come alive, growing and shifting, shapes that had no right to be there. She tried to dismiss them, to believe it was her mind playing tricks, but the shadows would draw closer each night, moving in a slow, relentless crawl. And then, one night, she saw it, the shape of a figure standing at the end of her bed. It was tall, impossibly tall, its limbs stretching in unnatural angles, filling the room with an icy chill. The figure had no face, only an endless darkness where its eyes should have been, watching her, studying her as she lay helpless. Mira's heart raced, pounding so loudly she was sure it would burst. But even though she was awake, fully aware of the horror before her, she could do nothing to escape. The figure moved closer, its shape shifting, limbs twisting as it leaned over her, filling her vision with shadows. She could feel its presence, cold and oppressive, an overwhelming dread that seemed to seep into her bones. And then it began to whisper. The voice was low and scratchy, words that she couldn't understand, yet they filled her with a primal fear, a terror that made her wish for unconsciousness. The figure's face, or lack thereof, was inches from hers, its breath icy against her skin, a hollow void that threatened to consume her whole. She shut her eyes, willing it to end, but the whispers grew louder, filling her mind with their dark, incomprehensible language. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, it was over. The weight lifted, her body free, her voice released in a strangled scream. But the room was empty, the shadows gone, leaving only the faint echoes of that sinister whisper lingering in the air. Mira convinced herself it was just a nightmare, a trick of the mind, but the visits continued. Each night the figure returned, growing bolder, staying longer, its whispers turning into something darker. Now, it wasn't just whispering. She could hear her name, called softly, almost affectionately, as if the figure was claiming her, binding her to the darkness. She tried to tell herself it wasn't real, that it was all in her head, but she could feel it. The icy touch on her skin, the faint grip of skeletal fingers tracing her arms, her face. And then one night it spoke more clearly than ever. "Mira," it said, its voice crawling through her like a disease. "I'm waiting." She awoke, drenched in sweat, every muscle tense, as if her body had been fighting against the force of the figure. But the worst part was what she saw when she opened her eyes. There on the ceiling, written in faint, barely visible lines, were words scratched into the paint, "I'm here." Mira's blood ran cold, and she bolted out of bed, heart hammering as she fled the room, her mind reeling with the realization that this was no mere dream. The figure, the whispers, the paralyzing terror, they were real. Desperate, she searched for answers, anything that could help her understand what was happening. She read about sleep paralysis, the science behind it, the explanations, but nothing explained the words on her ceiling, the feel of those cold, bony fingers. In a last-ditch effort, she contacted a sleep therapist, someone who specialized in sleep disorders. But as she explained her experiences, the figures she saw, the weight she felt, the therapist went silent. He listened carefully, but there was something in his expression that unsettled her. He looked at her not with disbelief, but with a kind of sad, fearful understanding. "You're not the first," he finally said. "People report seeing a shadow figure, feeling a weight, hearing voices, but I've never heard of anyone being marked." Mira's heart sank, and for the first time she truly felt the gravity of her situation. She wasn't just experiencing sleep paralysis, she was being haunted by something that existed in the spaces between dreams and reality, a darkness that was aware of her, connected to her. She was terrified to go back to bed, but she had no choice. The next night as she lay in bed, Her mind raced with fear, anticipation, dread. She fought to keep her eyes open, but eventually exhaustion took over, pulling her under. And sure enough, in the darkest hours of the night, she felt it, the weight pressing down, the icy touch creeping along her arms. Her eyes shot open, and there it was, closer than ever, its face mere inches from hers. This time, it didn't whisper. It simply watched her, unmoving, as if savoring her fear. She could feel it breathing, the empty darkness filling the room, suffocating her, consuming her. And then it spoke again, its voice echoing in her mind, as if it were inside her thoughts, an inescapable presence. "Don't fight it, Mira," it murmured, each word dripping with malice. "You belong to me now." Mira's eyes filled with tears, her heart pounding as she struggled to move, to scream, to do anything to break free. But she was trapped, helpless against the darkness that had claimed her. And as the figure loomed over her, its cold fingers tracing her skin, Mira realized with a chilling certainty that this was no longer a dream. This was her reality, a reality where she was forever bound to the shadows, haunted by a darkness that would never let her go.